The phone rang at 3:11 a.m., a single, shrill sound in the massive, humming silence of the regional control center. Spencer Collins didn't flinch. I never did. "We are cutting senior salaries," the director had smirked. So I powered down my console. That night, the regional grid failed. 3 states went dark. Reporters asked, "Human error?" The CEO answered quietly, "No, human absence." But that night, the night the phone rang, I was still present. Still the unseen, unacknowledged keeper of the lights. The cold ceramic mug of coffee was glued to my hand, the liquid long since gone cold. I lifted the receiver. "Collins, control floor. Go ahead." The voice that answered was young and thin, barely holding back panic. "I am seeing a swing in line 17 again, but the system isn't compensating. It is 3% drift, sir. 3%. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing the automated load balancers shouldn't have been able to correct in less than 3 seconds." But theory and the brutal Texas winter always found ways to disagree, especially when the barometric pressure dropped like a rock. My fingers, calloused from decades of touching terminals and actual wires, moved with the deep, lazy speed of absolute confidence. I didn't need to look at the blinking amber alert. I could already feel the specific kind of trouble that line 17 was brewing. A cold front was rolling in. It always made the old feeders twitch. The software, trained on averages and sunny days, always read it late. I typed a sequence of commands, manually adjusting the feeder load and dropping the draw from 62% to 54%. It took 12.7 seconds. The correction felt precise, like surgery. The amber alert died, replaced by a smooth, deep green. "You're good," I said into the silence. "It's stable now." The kid on the other end sputtered a grateful, fumbling thank you, clearly relieved that his early morning crisis was over. I didn't need it. I did this because the light stayed on across 3 states, because hospitals kept breathing, and because Oklahoma slept through its night shift. My value wasn't measured in gratitude. It was measured in non-events. Behind me, junior tech Chloe Mills, 24, watched with wide, observant eyes. She still believed in the power of a triple espresso and a good training manual. "How did you know it wasn't a sensor error?" she asked. She was leaning against the desk, her head tilted, trying to find the missing variable that allowed the system to fail and me to succeed. I took a slow sip of the cold coffee. I opened a file on my screen titled Contingency Patterns, stared at the contents for a second, then closed it again. I didn't need to read it, I had written it. "Line 17 always twitches during a barometric drop," I stated, the words sounding flat and technical. "Storm is coming." The software reads the data. Human eyes read the why. Chloe nodded, trying to absorb the information, but the difference between data and instinct was still an ocean to her. She was a good tech, but she thought the grid was a mathematical equation. I knew it was a living, temperamental beast. I pushed away from the desk, stretching my back slowly. The vertebrae popped, a low sound like popcorn kernels in oil. I didn't need a break, but I needed to do the one thing I didn't trust the computer to do. I walked to the far wall, past the humming server cores that Trent Holloway, the new corporate director, sometimes referred to as the pet robot. I reached up and pulled down a 3-inch thick binder. The spine was cracked, the pages stiff and marked with worn tabs and my own graphite notes. The cover read, Contingencies D1 through D7. It was all handwritten. All of it. I didn't trust files that could be deleted with one bad update or code that could be misinterpreted by the next genius with an MBA. I flipped to D3 overload plus faulty armation during winter demand. I scanned the page, pulled out a pencil, and added a fresh note in the margin. C17, a drift pattern noticed. Storm pre-signals likely by Thursday. Test overrides Wednesday. I drew a small star next to the note. No cameras recorded this. No biometric log tracked my judgment. The new systems only cared that I was present, not that I was essential. Chloe leaned in again. "Do you think the new load balancing system is ready for the storm?" I slid the binder back into its spot, the movement practiced and precise, like returning a finely honed sword to its sheath. I didn't laugh, though the question deserved it. "If it is, Chloe," I said, meeting her eyes, "it won't need me. But if it's not, well, let's hope it is." I finished my shift, correcting 5 more minor voltage inconsistencies and 2 relay fails, logging all reports myself. Trusting others to understand the nuance of my work was like handing a loaded pistol to a toddler with an itchy trigger finger. I changed out of my work coat, which hung on a hook labeled, in faint lettering, Legacy Staff. The coat felt heavy, weighted with the truth I knew things were changing. And for the grid, they were changing for the worst. The small victory of the early morning faded quickly under the weight of the coming day. I walked toward the break room, the coat labeled Legacy Staff feeling heavy, anticipating the inevitable meeting where my 2 decades of competence would be deemed an expensive redundancy. At precisely 10 o'clock a.m., the screens flickered to life. Company-wide video call, mandatory attendance. This was the modern sermon, where everyone nodded like bobbleheads trying to keep their jobs, and no one said anything honest. I sat in the back of the control room, arms crossed, thermos untouched, watching the pixelated face of Trent Holloway beam in. Trent looked like a used car salesman who had accidentally swallowed a LinkedIn profile. His hair was slicked back with too much gel, and he flashed teeth that looked power-washed. He was maybe 32 tops, and his entire resume read like a string of start-up failures and corporate buzzword bingo. He was the expert on what he called cost-to-val ratio optimization. I knew that meant one thing: he knew how to cut people. "Good morning, energy heroes," Trent chirped, throwing his arms wide in an overly dramatic gesture that blurred the pixels. "I am absolutely thrilled to lead this region into the modern era of energy delivery and digital transformation." My eye twitched. Transformation. That was the word they used when they wanted to delete institutional memory. I scanned the room. The younger techs were taking notes, trying to learn the new corporate language. Chloe, bless her optimistic heart, had highlighted the word transformation in pink marker. Trent's voice continued, a relentless, chipper assault on competence. "This region has a proud legacy, absolutely. But legacies don't power innovation. We need to be lean. My analysis shows a lopsided compensation curve. Too much weight in senior salaries, not enough in growth roles. My analysis shows a lopsided compensation curve. Too much weight in senior salaries, not enough in growth roles." There it was, the execution notice wrapped in a TED Talk. I didn't blink. I just stared at the screen. He kept talking, oblivious to the decades of knowledge he was trying to discard. "Lean systems outperform sentimental ones. We are auditing every 6-figure role to ensure it aligns with our forward-facing strategy." Behind him, his virtual background momentarily glitched, showing a crumpled takeout bag and a half-empty sparkling water bottle. I saw more authenticity in that digital trash than in the man speaking. He was all surface and ambition, nothing underneath. I didn't ask questions. I didn't type anything into the chat box. I simply clicked record screen and leaned back. The soft rhythmic tapping of my fingernails on the desk, 13 taps, was an old habit from my early coding days, a muscle memory from when I used to rebuild interface nodes by flashlight. Trent finally wrapped up the call with an irrelevant quote from a tech mogul. I closed the window like it was a browser tab full of malware. I felt a cold anger settle in my gut, replacing the dull fatigue I was used to. It wasn't just about the money or the job. It was about the dangerous arrogance of thinking a few algorithms could replace 2 decades of learned instinct. By lunchtime, Trent had materialized in person, strolling through the command floor like he was touring a factory he planned to shut down. He shook hands, posed for a selfie with a wide-eyed junior staffer, and even gave Chloe a fist bump that left her momentarily stunned. I sat alone in the break room, sipping my coffee and annotating my binder. Trent walked in with an HR representative, a woman named Janine who looked like she hadn't slept since college. Trent popped open a fancy cooler, and loud enough for me to hear, said to Janine, "You wouldn't believe how many grandma-level folks we've still got pulling 6 figures in this place." "Not for long," was the implied punchline. I looked up, meeting his eyes for a split second. No expression, no reaction. I simply returned to my notes, adding a small observation in the margin of D4, corporate tone escalation. Emotional safety degradation likely. He didn't notice me. He didn't even glance. Janine offered a fake, nervous HR laugh, the one you use when your own spine is on the line. I stood, dropped my paper cup in the trash, and walked past them without a word, my resentment hardening into a quiet, tactical resolve. I would not allow these people to turn my hard work into a predictable failure. I had to prove that true value was non-redundant. My cold anger solidified into resolve the moment my badge failed. I was walking out of the break room, still processing Trent's casual cruelty, when I tried to enter the manual override room. My security badge, one I'd carried for 24 years, failed twice. The little red light blinked a stubborn, digital denial. I frowned, pulled out my backup card, and tried again. Nothing. The console had a glossy black biometric upgrade, a new security measure I hadn't been informed about, with a cold green LED that I instantly distrusted. I flagged down Daniels, the operator relieving me, a good man who was simply too trusting of dashboards. "Why is the override system changed?" I asked him. He shrugged, already focused on his handover screen. "It pushed a firmware update yesterday. New protocols. I think they reset the credentials for anyone who hasn't logged manual use in 6 months." I stared at the console, feeling an insult deeper than Trent's smirk. I wrote the manual use protocols. Daniels blinked, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. "Wait, seriously?" I didn't answer. I just walked away. The incident was not random, it was tactical. My lack of recent manual log-ins was a feature of my competence. I fixed problems before they required the override room, and they had used it to lock me out. Back at my desk, I logged into the admin interface. My basic login credentials were intact. I could still view, monitor, and write reports. But the core power, the ability to act without asking permission, my root override privileges, were blanked out. My name was absent from the manual escalation chain. The system I had built no longer trusted me to be a final decision maker. I sent a ticket to IT, an exercise in futility. The reply came immediately, a canned message from an automated mailbox. Per Policy 7B, all legacy users must submit reauthorization through central operations. I closed the message. In my physical notebook, I wrote one line, removed from my own system. They call it modernization. I call it unlearning the fire drill. The rest of the shift was a fog. I watched Trent give a ground floor town hall speech about algorithmic efficiency. I muted the audio and looked down at my hands. They were calloused, steady, capable of spotting a faulty capacitor with nothing more than a flashlight and a hunch. Now, they were officially less qualified than an artificial intelligence trained on 3 months of outage logs and corporate fantasies. The funny part was I wasn't mad. Not yet. Not the shaking, yelling kind of mad. It was colder than that. It was a calculated, absolute realization of my relevance. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, old-in-my speed drive, labeled in my spidery handwriting a last resort clean. I put it in my coat pocket. Trent didn't invite me to a conference room. He summoned me to a stage, a glass, walled executive office designed to make any private conversation feel like a public performance. Janine from HR was there, holding a manila folder thick with NDAs and severance forms. Trent leaned back, settling into his role as corporate executioner. "So, listen, Spencer," he said, too familiar, too breezy. "We're implementing necessary rebalancing across our operational tiers. Efficiency reviews, streamlining, aligning with corporate's long-term vision." I sat across from him, my face still as stone. My thermos made a sharp, rude little click as I set it on the glass table, the metal against the brittle quiet. Trent smiled wider. "Effective this pay cycle, your salary will be adjusted by 51%, pending final redundancy review. It is not personal. It is policy. You maintain your role and current responsibilities in the interim." I let 3 full seconds pass. Janine kept her gaze locked on her folder. I lifted my eyes to meet Trent's. "Do you understand what happens?" I asked, my voice flat. "If the substation fails during manual sync, what if the new load balancer fails to switch on phase 2? And the demand surge hits while the system is still sinking? Do you understand what happens?" I waited. He couldn't answer the question, and I watched his composure crack. Trent shifted, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "That is what the software is for, isn't it?" I smiled. For the first time in months, the corners of my mouth curled up. It was the smile of someone watching a child about to touch a hot stove after being warned repeatedly. It was not amusement. I stood slowly, picked up my thermos, and slid it into my tote bag. "We will need you to acknowledge receipt of the..." Trent started. I didn't wait. I walked to my station, unplugged my ID badge reader, and typed in one last entry into the system log, a status transition initiated, local access secured, field-level credentials retained per SE CETA compliance. I opened the drawer no one had touched since 2014. Inside sat the thick binder, tabs worn to the color of nicotine stains. It smelled like dust, graphite, and truth. I flipped to D5 substation collapse during cold surge manual override procedure when AI lockout detected. I had written that line 10 winters ago in red ink. I do not trust the AI to reroute voltage. Override manually at 74% capacity threshold. Delay equals failure. I slid the binder into my bag. No one noticed. The biometric logs didn't care. I walked toward the exit. Trent followed halfway, hands held out in a display of confused authority. Hey, whoa, no need to be dramatic. We're just reviewing. You haven't even signed the adjustment form. I paused at the threshold, turned back, and looked at the director who valued spreadsheets over stability. I used the same flat, quiet tone I used to talk down a rolling brownout. You took my judgment out of the loop, I said. Don't be surprised when the loop fails. And then I left. I didn't look back. The door hissed shut behind me, the soft pneumatic sound marking the final severing of my employment. I didn't stop, but the walk across the parking lot felt different. Lighter, in a way, because the burden of unnoticed responsibility was gone, yet heavy with the promise of what was coming. Back at my now empty station, the screen defaulted to the generic login prompt. My old chair still held the shape of my weight. Daniels, the relief operator, finally broke the silence in the control room. Did he just quit? Daniels muttered. No one answered. Everyone else was pretending to type, but the tension was visible in the way they held their shoulders, tight and expectant. On the mainframe, a simple diagnostic routine I had created in 2008 ran one last time. It returned a status of manual sync protocol unverified. Recommend review before next storm cycle. The system, under its new automation rules, ignored it completely. There was no one left authorized to approve that kind of human warning. My final whisper vanished into the logs like static. I drove home to my ranch-style house on the edge of Garland. It was the place my ex-wife had left me with, a home that felt more like a fortress against noise than a cozy refuge. Before sunrise, I slid a folded letter under the Human Resources office door. It was short 8 lines, plain text, my name, a date, and 2 words. Effective immediately, no fanfare, no explanation. By the time the coffee pot sputtered its first full brew inside the grid headquarters, I was already gone, and the control floor felt wrong without me. Not quiet, there were always beeps and status chimes, but hollow like a deep well running dry. At 9:12 a.m., Trent swaggered through the office. He clapped Daniels on the back and scanned the room, saying loudly, well, no hard feelings. He was retiring soon anyway. Automation's replacing that whole workflow in 6 weeks. Nobody laughed. Daniels didn't even blink. My desk was stripped clean. No personal items, no photos, not even the faint ring from my thermos. The whiteboard behind my station, once covered in my complex, handwritten voltage predictions and fallback diagrams, had been wiped clean with ruthless corporate efficiency. Except for one thing. Dead center on the whiteboard, held down by a neon pink magnet, was a sticky note. 3 words, black Sharpie, all caps AS Befomadas. That was it. No signature, no arrow, just those 4 inches of fluorescent paper, carrying the entire weight of my 2 decades of experience. Chloe found it at lunchtime. Is this a joke? She asked aloud, her voice filled with apprehension. Daniels walked over and read it, then looked toward the simulation monitor. The cold front hits Monday. Yeah, but the system passed the load test last week, Chloe said, trying to reassure herself. Daniels didn't respond. He just stared at the sticky note like it was a prophecy written in fire. Trent overheard the conversation and waved the warning away dismissively. He always thought worst case. That note is just parting paranoia. We've already pushed the AI thresholds up. The system adjusts in real time. He said it like someone who believed a complicated power grid was nothing more than a smart thermostat. In a forgotten corner of the server room, my contingency script, the simple diagnostic routine I'd created in 2008, was still present in the job queue, but marked disabled by the last corporate patch. The log entry read, obsolete manual process flagged for review. I had anticipated this too. They couldn't delete what they didn't know existed, but they could certainly ignore what they deemed obsolete. I drove out to my shed, pulled down a fireproof safe, and unlocked it. Inside sat my old, credentialed tablet, the one with the root-level access I hadn't needed in years, and the USB drive labeled Last Resort Clean. I placed them both on my kitchen counter. I picked up the beige landline, the kind with the coiled cord and the ring like a war siren. I called the diner down the street and ordered my usual 2 eggs over medium, wheat toast, and a side of hash browns. When the waitress asked if I wanted my usual booth, I said no. I will take it to go. Storm is coming. By the end of the day, corporate had purged my user profile from the directory. My override credentials were gone, at least on paper. They never found the back door I wrote in 2006, the one I filed under a deprecated diagnostic routine called Winter Map Legacy Syncs. And still, that sticky note stayed on the whiteboard all weekend. Neon pink, 3 words, slowly collecting dust as the temperatures dropped outside. Nobody ran the tests. They were too busy preparing their Monday readiness decks. Friday night passed without incident. Saturday morning arrived with the snap of frost on the air, the first real bite of winter rolling off the plains. The ominous cold front was no longer a theoretical line on a graph. It was a physical threat. At 6:42 am, a junior technician named Kyle, recently poached for his coding background but lacking any operational instinct, stared at a diagnostic screen he didn't fully understand. The screen flagged it as caution sync mismatch, a warning in yellow, not red. Red meant stop. Yellow meant you could keep going if you squinted and pretended it wasn't your problem. What Kyle didn't know was that the sync mismatch was tied to a manual escalation hook, a delicate mechanism I had embedded years ago to catch late-night drift between substations during sudden cold surges. The new automation update had flagged it only because it didn't recognize the routine. The system thought my code was obsolete. So Kyle, following the path of least resistance and corporate policy, clicked 5 override warning. The log updated the status pass with exception. 15 seconds later, the warning vanished from the active screen. It was still buried in the backend logs, of course, but no one checked those unless the building was already on fire. He had officially started the failure sequence. At 8:03 am, Trent sat in a studio downtown, recorded for a segment on the local news titled New Faces of Energy Leadership. Makeup was dusted on his nose, and he was smiling broadly for the camera. "We have modernized our control team," Trent beamed. "Streamlined it. We are embracing innovation over institutional dependency. I believe in our software and our people, and in the future of a frictionless energy experience." The anchor nodded. "So, no more reliance on, say, long-tenured employees or manual overrides." Trent chuckled, the sound thin and artificial. "Let's just say we are no longer running on gut instinct." I watched the interview from a tiny cafe in Greenville, Texas, 20 miles from my home. My thriller novel was open to chapter 14 but untouched since chapter 11. I chose a window seat, not for the view of the snow-dusted street, but for the plug socket. My tablet sat in my tote bag, powered down, still holding every contingency I'd written in the last 2 decades. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just watched Trent's face flicker on the mounted flat screen, glowing like a bad omen reflected in the coffee-stained chrome. When the sports ticker ran across the bottom, the sound automatically muted, and I returned to my book, preferring the detective who solved murders by noticing small, quiet details. The waitress came by. "Need a refill, Han?" I nodded. "Just decaf?" Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the eaves. You could feel the storm in the air, heavy, sharp, full of invisible edges. Back at Grid HQ, Daniels was sweating through a diagnostic rerun. He'd seen Kyle approve that yellow warning, and now, something about the sync timing felt wrong. He tried to pull the backend log, but immediately hit a permissions wall. Post-update protocol 9b air only managerial accounts could access flagged redundancies. Trent had restricted Daniels' clearance the week prior, claiming it prevented confusion. So Daniels wrote a note in his physical notebook. "Full sync log Monday 7 am. Double-check surge thresholds." He underlined it twice. He didn't know that by Monday, those logs would be useless, or that 3 states would be running on the razor's edge of untested code. In the cafe, I glanced up again. The TV had switched to weather. Snowstorm advisory upgraded to severe across the southern and central plains. Peak demand expected Monday morning, 4 am to 8 am. The map looked like someone had spilled blue ink across 3 states. I reached for a napkin, jotted down 2 words: Monday surge. The waitress returned with my refill. "Storm's going to be nasty," she said. I gave the smallest nod. It always is when folks think they've got it solved. I folded the napkin, slid it into my novel, and pushed my mug away, untouched. By late afternoon, Trent was trending on social media. His interview was reposted with a caption that read future, driven leadership inside the grid of tomorrow. Someone had added a sparkle emoji. I watched the last sliver of sunlight vanish behind a wall of gray clouds rolling in low and heavy over the plains. I didn't reach for my tablet. Not yet. The first flicker hit Amarillo at 7:18 p.m. Saturday night. A blink. Half a second of hesitation in the grid. Most people didn't notice, but the systems did. Deep in the code, the mainframe spat out a single word drift. The automation kicked in, redirecting the load, but the new AI optimizer had not synced with the legacy fallback triggers. Instead of staggering the reroute across 3 lines, it shoved all the power down one. By 7:26 p.m., a second substation near the Panhandle hiccuped. Traffic lights twitched. A municipal pump tripped offline. Still nothing major, not enough for the new hires to panic. But by 7:31 p.m., the system registered a cascading delay in load verification. The automation should have slowed the draw, but the AI interpreted the delay as a sensor error and ignored it. The collapse had begun. The second hiccup had been an isolated incident. But by 7:44 p.m., the automated system was registering a full cascading delay in load verification. It should have immediately slowed the draw. But the new AI interpreted the delay as a sensor malfunction and continued to shove power down the compromised line. The collapse was no longer theoretical. Chloe, tired and wired on vending machine coffee, watched as another alert flashed angry red on the diagnostics terminal. She didn't hesitate this time. She ran straight to the station and did the one thing I had pounded into her head on her 3rd day. Trust the surge. Question the comm. The screen lit up with critical mismatches across 4 substations. She grabbed the emergency line handset and dialed the override dispatch. It rang 4 times, then a recorded message. We are sorry. All emergency operators are currently assisting others. Please leave a message. She slammed the phone down and redialed. Same message. Daniels was off shift. Kyle was in the server room, baffled because his physical access badge no longer let him into the manual override panel. Corporate had revoked physical access pending new security clearances. By 8 o'clock p.m., 2 secondary substations tripped offline simultaneously. Lights vanished across 30 square miles of rural grid. It wasn't a full blackout yet, but it was enough that people started checking their phones and wondering if the storm had arrived early. In my house, I sat on the couch in the dim light. I hadn't lost power. My old generator in the garage had kicked in 5 minutes earlier. Outside, the wind screamed through the eaves, sleet tapping the windows like nervous fingernails. I knew what was happening, not because I was watching the feed, but because the system now had no guardian. When you remove the spine, the body still walks for a while, until it falls. At 8:17 p.m., Chloe frantically tried to trigger the manual escalation script. It failed. The screen flashed a stark message in white on black: A escalation blocked. Override credential required. She hit the button again. Same result. She searched the directory for an alternate administrator. Nothing. She called Daniels, got his voicemail and hung up, her hands shaking with mounting helplessness. Override blocked, buried beneath the glossy automation layers. Behind the dashboards Trent loved to show off, my legacy script sat like a sleeping dog with teeth. I had written it during the 2011 freeze, after 3 substations failed in unison. Back then, I hard-coded a rule: no mass escalation during a winter surge without credentialed manual approval. I submitted it to IT, they ignored it. So I buried it deep in a utility routine disguised as a redundancy check, flagged to only activate if the automation crossed a specific mismatch threshold. That threshold had been crossed at 8:03 p.m. The system was now following orders it couldn't understand. Orders to wait. Orders to pause. Orders that required a name and a code that only one person still alive knew: mine. I picked up my tablet from the coffee table, powered it on. The screen glowed green. The wind ripped a large branch from my neighbor's tree, hitting my siding with a violent shudder. I didn't flinch. I felt no triumph, no glee, only a cold, hollow certainty. My login prompt appeared. In the top corner, a warning flashed: escalation request region 3, credential required. Time remaining 013219. The system had finally routed the request to my legacy access. The timer ticked down, minute by minute, putting the entire failing grid in my hands. Trent arrived at HQ shortly after 9 p.m. He stood in the command floor, his hair messy, his tie loosened, a ring of sweat clinging to his underarms. He was holding a phone to each ear. "Fix it," he screamed at the IT director over the line. "Fix the system. Reboot the automation. Run the patch again. I don't care how." A tiny, stressed voice responded. "Sir, we can't. The system is in credential-locked escalation. It's requesting override authorization from a flagged root user. Protocol doesn't allow rerouting without it." Trent slammed his palm against the desk, then changed the protocol. "Sir," the voice paused. "That user is D. Collins." Silence descended on the control room. Trent looked up at Daniels, who had just arrived, jacket half on, cheeks wind-burned. "D. Collins," Trent repeated. "She's retired." Daniels nodded slowly. "Yes. And she's the only one who ever updated the escalation logic, built the fallback routines. She hardwired the override credential." Another voice came in from IT. "We can't even see the script. It's legacy. Handwritten, not documented in the last patch cycle. The system's treating it like law." "Can you trace it?" Trent demanded. "We did. It's pinging her credentialed device. A tablet, probably, but it's offline." Trent's face drained of color. He picked up the old landline and dialed my number with the desperate fear of a man whose parachute was packed with paper towels. Voicemail. He tried my email. It bounced. At 5:18 a.m., he turned to the room. His arrogance fully melted away. Anyone in here know how to bypass her script?" Dead silence. The automation screens pulsed a deep, continuous red. The load drift continued to worsen. The AI was paralyzed, waiting for a human it couldn't replace, a credential it couldn't forge. The entire regional grid was stalled on a line of code written by the employee they had just dismissed for being too expensive and too obsolete. The grid was stalled, the AI paralyzed, and the name D. Collins was being whispered like a curse and a prayer inside the headquarters. But in a small ranch house 20 miles outside Garland, I sat in the dark. My generator had kicked on, a low, comfortable rumble in the garage, a sound of self-reliance. My kettle hissed on the gas stove. The tablet sat in front of me, awake now, glowing with a soft green light. The screen flashed once. "Request manual override authorization level A confirmed to engage full system sync." Below it, the dreadful countdown was relentless, remaining time to collapse 0002941. I stared at it. My fingers twitched, a tremor that I hadn't felt in years. Not during storms, not during grid failures, not even during the divorce when my ex-wife had said she was taking the truck and the house, leaving me with nothing but silence. But now my hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of the coming choice. To log in meant saving them. It meant an immediate patch, a swift resolution to the crisis. The power would be up within hours, the infants in the hospital and ICUs breathing easy, the traffic flowing again. But logging in also meant letting Trent win. It meant patching a wound caused by arrogance so deep that it would fester again the moment the lights came back on. It meant reaffirming the corporate belief that human judgment was disposable until the moment the algorithm failed, only to be tossed aside once the crisis passed. I would be their stopgap, their emergency brake, and then I would be obsolete once more. I pushed the tablet aside, got up, and poured tea into a cracked ceramic mug that said "Watt Warrior" in faded red letters. I sat back down and wrapped both hands around the mug, holding the warmth as something more sacred than power. Outside, the storm had begun in earnest. Wind gusts like freight trains, branches snapping. Somewhere down the block, a transformer burst in a crack of horrifying blue lightning. I watched the countdown tick in the corner of the screen, 0002753. No one had asked me to stay. No one had believed I was still necessary. Now, we were all learning what my absence truly meant. And still, I didn't reach for the tablet. By 4:47 a.m. Sunday morning, Amarillo went completely dark, a full, dead black. 3 seconds later, Wichita Falls followed. Then Tulsa. Then Texarkana, tripping like a falling domino, taking every smaller substation tethered to it down as well. Within 4 minutes, 17 hospitals across 3 states switched to backup generators. 7 of those failed within the hour, old diesel systems choked by the cold and disuse. 2 NICUs had to be evacuated. The grid that kept the lights staggered and the intersections orderly turned into a haunted maze of frozen, unlit chaos. Back at HQ, Trent stood in the command floor like a prophet whose god had stopped returning calls. He was red in the face, holding a phone pressed tight. "D. Collins." He screamed into the receiver. "Call her. Email her. Knock on her door. I don't care. Get her to log in." Daniels, now present, muttered, "She doesn't answer. Hasn't since Friday." Trent tried corporate, yelling about NDAs and lawsuits. Nobody answered with anything useful. The automation screens pulsed red, the AI paralyzed, waiting for a human it couldn't replace. Inside my living room, my generator purring softly, I watched the countdown. It hurt. It hurt in a way that was physical and cold, a hollow ache of vindication wrapped in barbed wire. I could have stopped it hours ago, I knew that. But this collapse wasn't a surprise. It was a prophecy ignored. I looked at the tablet again. The time remaining was now critically low. I thought of the father in Bentonville sitting in a silent waiting room. I thought of Chloe, terrified, trapped in a failing control room. But I kept my hands folded. They hadn't listened when I told them to test the system. They hadn't seen my value until it cost them everything. I had to let the consequence run its course. The wind howled, and I finally understood. My final act of service was the most difficult, teaching them the difference between an algorithm and a judgment. At 7:26 a.m., the CEO of Tree State Grid Management appeared on a separate segment, live from a darkened downtown boardroom lit only by camera lights and a generator. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He said one sentence that changed everything. "This wasn't sabotage," he said into the camera, his voice low and defeated. "This was subtraction." With that, the story broke wide open. The lie was exposed, and the truth, though destructive, finally had room to breathe. My name, Spencer Collins, leaked from an engineer who still hung around the edges of disaster. My old ID badge photo went viral, a faded smile, eyes squinting from too many double shifts. The entire collapse had a name now, the Cascade, and I was the ghost who pulled the plug. I watched the headlines on my tiny wood stove television. I saw Trent stammer and the CEO confess. I had chosen a difficult, destructive truth over immediate heroism. My tea was cold, the tablet remained untouched. I had done what I had to do. The CEO's words, "This was subtraction," had ripped through the corporate crisis like a thunderbolt, validating every warning I had made. My name, Spencer Collins, was everywhere. Lawmakers invoked me like a ghost, the lost institutional memory, the final line of defense. The entire collapse was laid bare as a consequence of Trent's arrogance. Trent wasn't in the office. He had resigned quietly the night before, his scrubbed social media profile the only testament to his failure. The official report would eventually cite procedural gaps and oversight failures, but the public knew the truth. Back at the control center, the technicians were desperate. Daniels finally noticed the sticky note, still clinging to the whiteboard, fluorescent pink and slanted slightly to the left. He says run tests before Monday. He stood there staring at it while the room buzzed with frantic calls, whispering, he told us. The grid came back online on Wednesday. It was a slow, agonizing process. IT teams worked overtime, their faces drawn with fatigue, using manuals they didn't know existed until my handwritten binder was pulled from the drawer, photocopied in full, and distributed. Sections of my 2006 code, once flagged as obsolete, were reinstated line for line. Daniels took the sticky note, laminated it, and taped it to the glass case over the main breaker board. Run tests before Monday. It was a permanent scar, a reminder that competence could not be budgeted out of existence. The staff stopped laughing at legacy binders and started asking better questions. Chloe led a small team to build a new escalation protocol, one that required dual approvals, human and system. She titled it GS Collins 01. It was her way of honoring the lesson learned through the darkness. The corporate board, facing hundreds of millions in economic losses and multiple lawsuits, officially offered me my job back. Full pay, backdated, and a new title that guaranteed independence. I never responded. Instead, I spent Thursday morning in my shed, oiling the old generator that had kept my lights on. I hummed a tune that no one heard anymore, feeling the kind of quiet peace I hadn't known when I was desperately trying to keep the regional grid alive. Somewhere down the street, kids had chalked my driveway with hearts and lightning bolts. A neighbor left a homemade pie on my porch with a note that simply said, You kept us warm. Thank you I didn't answer the door. I let the tablet die completely on the counter. But I ate the pie and I smiled, just once, when the house lights flickered back on as the rest of the city finally joined my small, self-sufficient island of power. The system was rebuilt. They had learned to value the code I left behind, the rules I imposed, and the contingencies I predicted. They built systems to replace me, but none to understand me. And that was their final failure, and my absolute, lasting victory. My absence had created the necessary space for the truth to be seen.